In the distant 90s, Brazil was simply owned by Jiu Jitsu, which gained huge popularity thanks to the bright performance of Royce Gracie. For many, what they saw was a real discovery when thin and small Gracie made fighters of all sizes and styles tap and surrender. But not everyone was so fascinated and bewitched by BJJ. There were those who understood the importance of striking skills, and one of the very first and famous Brazilians who wasn't crazy about Jiu-Jitsu was Marco Ruas, nicknamed the King of the Streets. And in this video we will recall the brightest moments of the legend of the 90s and how he performed in the UFC and the Vale Tudo tournaments where a real massacre was. Before starting to fight in rings and cages, Marco mastered the beaches of Brazil. According to his stories, he had more than 100 street battles and never lost. From there, he got his nickname, the King of the Streets. Ruas never claimed the title of Master of all sports, but he also tried a lot of things during his career. At various times, he practiced luta livre, jiu-jitsu, taekwondo, capoeira, and also became the champion of Brazil in boxing and Muay Thai. Marco's first official duel took place back in 1984 at a tournament where jitsers and luchadors were trying to sort things out in their not the best relationship. If anyone doesn't know, their confrontation at one time was so hot that the battles ended not in harmless brawls, but in a real war between two armies with weapons and shooting, which only the National Guard could tame. So in 1997, after the Pentagon Combat Tournament, ultimate fights in Rio de Janeiro were banned for a long 10 years. But back to Ruas, who represented luchadors, and since not everyone has 3D glasses by the hand, we will look at this fight on rewind. It passed all the 20 minutes, and since the judges had not yet been invented by that time, the fight ended in a draw. The next time, Ruas performed 8 years later and choked Brazilian Francisco in the first minute, and judging by the difficulty with which they dragged him away, something personal was definitely present in this battle. In 1995, Marco was invited to UFC 7, while he was invited to represent the Gracie clan, namely the Carlson Gracie school, but Ruas refused, explaining that he preaches and learns completely different from Gracie and will represent Vale Tudo, not Jiu-Jitsu. So he showed out for the tournament. Marco Ruas, nicknamed King of the Streets, Ruas Vale Tudo style. The tournament in which Marco performed became one of the most iconic as it was held in New York, after which MMA was banned in this state for 20 years and only Alvarez and McGregor lifted this New York curse in 2016. Also, pay-per-view sales of the 7th tournament set a record that was broken only at the UFC 40, Ortiz vs Shamrock. The knockout tournament, and to win, Marco needs to finish off 3 opponents in the evening, while injuries, fatigue and other factors are of no interest to anyone. The first who went to Ruas was the US kickboxing champion Larry Curtin with a loud nickname Thunderfoot, and this fight was his second. At the UFC 5, Larry had already lost to Todd Medina by knockout. Marco decided not to give Larry a chance and neutralize his thunderous leg. He immediately went into clinch and stabbed the kickboxer into the canvas, but Larry wasn't so simple, and due to his strength and power swept Ruas and ended up on top. Marco perfectly used his versatility. On the ground, Larry really couldn't do anything with him, and when he got to his feet, he got caught in the heel hook of that exact leg, and he had to tap as a sign of surrender. So the first fight for Marco was pretty easy and he reached the semi-finals, but the difficulty level also grew up, and on the second stage he got into the Dutchman Remco Pardoel, nicknamed Grizzly, who quite matched his nickname. He was a huge entitled jitser with a black belt, and besides he was also practicing judo and taekwondo, as well as a 2-time champion of Germany, Netherlands and the world in jiu-jitsu. And to all this, Remco was 25 kilos heavier than Ruas. Marco this time didn't go to clinch, but began to cycle and strike low kicks. Remco had his own key to this bike of Marco. He grabbed Brazilian in his bear hug and took him into the net, doing absolutely nothing. Even with a seemingly tight grip on the neck, Remco was afraid to lose the position and didn't try to finish the opponent with a guillotine. Realizing his sad situation, Marco found a way out of the situation in order to somehow steer up Remco. He began to stomp his feet and revive the bored spectators. With a slight toe, Remco takes Ruas to the ground, but Marco is on top and tries to hold the submission on his leg. Despite the great regalia of Pardoel, on the ground he looked not like a grizzly, but rather like a teddy bear, whose motto seemed to be the main thing is not victory but participation. As soon as Marco entered the mound, Remco decided not to tempt fate anymore and tapped in surrender. So he lost this fight, but 12 minutes of fussing exhausted Ruas pretty much, and the final battle awaited him. The second who reached the finals of the tournament was a fighter from Alaska, the now passed away Paul Valens, nicknamed the Polar Bear, who unlike Marco ran over two opponents, spending only 2 minutes and without even having time to sweat out for the final battle. At the same time, he was also much heavier and larger than Ruas. According to the traditions of the old school, Valens immediately jumped on board, but several hits cooled his passion. Ruas smashed the giant on the way out and was giving out low kicks to Paul, and there were more and more every minute. When the bear overtook Marco and entered the clinch, he simply tried to rip off the nimble Brazil's head, but Marco's neck was hardened by the beaches of Brazil, so these attempts of the bear were useless. At the 14th minute of the fight, Paul's leg was completely broken and he collapsed. The referee worked very competently and didn't allow Valens to take a couple of 3 extra punches, as the bear fell on the canvas and was already wondering how long he would limp from such a high dosage of low kicks. So Marco Ruas, in a pretty bright style, became the champion of the 7th tournament and, in my opinion, was the first in UFC who so nicely got an opponent with low kicks. Anyway, Ruas was the first real all-rounder who could fight both on the ground and in the standing position, and for each opponent he picked up his own key to win. Ruas wrote his name into history, becoming one of the few champions of the first knockout tournaments. There were only 7 of them, and most of them became real legends, on whom such a popular sport as MMA began to be built. Also in the future, at one of the open votings, Marco got into 10 favorite fighters for UFC fans. If initially the UFC was planned as a one-time event, then by 1995 the popularity and interest in fights among the audience grew up at a tremendous pace, and the organizers made more and more interesting moves. They held a special KO tournament in which the champions of past tournaments and the main stars of the promotion took part, and the main prize was $150k, which went to the winner. At the first stage, Marco got a karate fighter with several black belts in different disciplines, Keith Hackney, nicknamed the Giant Killer. Although Kit should be feared not only by giants but also by rapists, since he was also good at hitting balls. The beginning of the fight was pretty calm, scouting with low kicks and clinch from Ruas, after which Marco pulls Hackney to the ground and starts ramming him in a street style with punches to the back of the head. A couple of these tough series took hold and the fight was stopped in the 3rd minute. Marco made it to the semi-finals of the tournament and fell into the 6th tournament champion Oleg Taktarov, who at the first stage stopped Canadian wrestler Dave Bonetto with an Achilles. Marco was better than Oleg in the standing, and he decided to do the same with him as Valens in the final of the 7th tournament. He kept his distance and punched heavy low kicks, while in the first minutes he defended himself well from takedowns. The left one on a jump from Taktarov, and then the guillotine with the densest lock on Marco's neck, which had previously shown that it wasn't so easy to choke him, and in this case Oleg also failed and his efforts were wasted. After the guillotine, the fighters were returned to their stance, and before the end of the round, the speed sank to the minimum. The fighters circled around the ring and occasionally exchanged blows, while it was Oleg who was the aggressor, and Marco seemed not to want to fight, which became one of the most important factors. Oleg Taktarov took the fight by a unanimous decision of the judges and went to the final of the tournament, where he lost to Dan Severn, and Marco Ruas suffered his defeat in fights without rules and didn't perform in UFC for 4 years. This confrontation had its continuation. A year later they met again at the Vale Tudo tournament in Brazil, and this time the fight passed all the allowed half an hour, and since there were no judges at the tournament, a draw was fixed. Later, in an interview, Oleg said that he was paid a double fee for the fight with Marco, and according to the condition, he shouldn't have taken down the Brazilian champion for 29 minutes out of all 30. In this battle, Oleg got a lot of blows, and by the end of the fight, his whole face was covered in blood. But as I said earlier, there were no judges and the fight ended in a draw. After a successful business trip to America, Marco returned to Brazil and competed in Vale Tudo tournaments. His first opponent was the most random UFC tournament champion, Ninja Cop Steve Janum, who won the third tournament with only one fight, the final one. He replaced the injured Ken Shamrock and became champion by beating Harold Howard. The beginning of the fight, and Ruas immediately takes Cop to the ground, and there he works hard from the side control, showing that Janum's ninjutsu will not work in this battle. It looks like Steve himself already understands this, deciding not to take unnecessary damage. He taps and admits defeat, while Janum fought another fight which he lost and ended his career with an overall record of 2-3. But he still got the UFC champion belt and may consider his short career not so inglorious. March 16, 1997, the 4th Vale Tudo World Championship, and Marco's rival is another pioneer of fighting without rules and the late kickboxer Patrick Smith, who was also one of the pioneers who became the finalist of the second UFC tournament and had a fight over Andy Hug. Exchange with heavy low kicks and transfer to the ground from Ruas, but Smith wins a position that becomes fatal for him. While Pat pressed Marco into canvas, Ruas managed to get out on the heel twist, which he carried out with his hands tied and his eyes closed. A beautiful and quick victory for Marco, who after receiving the belt of the Superfights Vale Tudo champion went to Japan, namely to Pride, which could afford to invite any fighter and offer any conditions, and usually no one refused. Pride 2 tournament, Marco met Big Daddy Gary Goodrich, who showed himself brightly at the first tournament by knocking out another UFC champion Oleg Taktarov, and Gary wanted to continue the fiesta. In the first minutes, Marco immediately realized that taking a large caliber grenade from the daddy is very traumatic, and if Taktarov couldn't move Gary down and unscrew that leg, then Marco did it well. Big Daddy controlled Ruas almost the entire round on the canvas and rammed with lethal cannons, but Marco's signature move came to an aid. At the last minute of the round, he grabbed Gary's leg and made a heel hook, which ended this fight. So, Big Daddy suffered his first defeat in Pride, and Marco made a beautiful comeback, although in the next fight he lost to the Japanese Alexander Otsuka, for whom this upset became one of the few bright spots in his career. In addition to this victory over the legend of Brazilian fights without rules, Alex managed to win another fight with the rarest move, a double armbar. Otherwise, by the 2002, his record was 2 victories and 12 defeats. After such a fail with Japanese Alex, Marco returned to UFC, where they had already forgotten about the KO tournaments, and the rules were slowly beginning to take on the form that we know now. The UFC 21 tournament was called the Return of Champions, and in the main event of the evening, Marco Ruas fought another heavyweight champion, Maurice Smith. Maurice was the most dangerous striker with whom Marco had to fight at all, so clinching and transferring to the ground from Ruas doesn't raise any surprises or questions. But Smith himself was once being smashed by the ground and pound of GMP's daddy Mark Coleman, so after such stress, nobody and nothing will scare Smith on the ground. Marco tried several times to twist the heel, a technique that brought him victories in difficult fights, but Maurice didn't allow Ruas to submit himself, and the first round was over. Unfortunately, at the time of trying the submission, Ruas himself suffered a knee injury and was unable to enter the second round, so Maurice Smith won in this fight between the two champions, and this fight was the first of 2 between these fighters. The next time they met was already in 2007, when both were over 40 and Marco came out after 8 years of inactivity and covered with rust. Lost to Smith in the first round when his corner threw out a towel, as Ruas couldn't do anything with Smith's advantage. So, this was Ruas' short career of the first UFC all-rounder with a total statistics of 9 wins, 4 losses and 2 draws. In one of his interviews, Ruas admitted that he really regrets that he couldn't hold more fights under the brand of UFC, but everything turned out because of disagreements between his manager and the UFC bosses. Later, Marco was engaged in training activities, and one of his most famous students was Pedro Hizo, who I hope will also appear sooner or later in one of my reviews. So if you liked the video and you want to see my work more often, then support the video with likes, reposts and comments so that it promotes better. Also, if you are not subscribed, subscribe and click on the bell so as not to miss new videos.